This leads to my next question, that how should the teaching of history and social studies be revitalized given this threat from a supremacist government, ideology? And what would you tell a young person who now has access outside the official text? How should he or she approach the learning of history?
Well, I think the first thing really to explain is that history is not a body of information consisting of dates and events. History is an understanding of the past. And I would underline again and again the word understanding the past. It is not even what was the truth, it's not even what was correct or anything. We don't know. The past can't be revived. We'll never know what the absolute truth was about the past. The maximum that we can do is to use various methods of analysis to try and arrive at the understanding of a problem, the problem being the reconstruction of the past. Now, if you're speaking to a young person and you want to make this point clear because it sounds very abstract, I would say that you turn to the person and you say, look, you're surrounded by all kinds of things. There's a whole world of objects that surrounds you. There's a whole world of relationships that surround you. There's a whole world of thoughts that you think. Each of these has a history. The chair you're sitting on has a history. The house you're living in has a history. The town you're living in has a history. So what are we doing with this history? Are we really understanding it? Because like the biography of a person, when you meet a person for the first time and you get to like the person and you become slightly friendly, inevitably you ask the question, what is your name? Where do you come from? How much does your husband earn? How many children do you have? Where do you originally come from? What language do you speak? It is the history of the person. The biography is essentially the history of the individual. In the same way, the whole world that surrounds us has a biography, which is history. And in order to understand the world that surrounds us today, we have to understand what happened in the past. We have to know how we have arrived at this point today. This has been a long process of evolution and change and continuity and change and so on. That has to be understood, and that is really what history is about.
So going to the original text, understanding the language, looking at different interpretations, and I think keeping your own identity outside the learning and teaching of history is critical.
Well, that is very difficult to do. It's very difficult to keep your own identity outside because, you know, as we all know, without having to go to deconstruction, we all know that everybody has an identity which creeps in. However much one says, I don't have a bias. And I have a great suspicion of people who come to me and say, I write good history because I'm not biased. I feel like saying this is nonsense. Of course you're biased. We're all biased. It's a question of, are we aware of our bias? And do we explain when we're writing our history that there is a bias which will come through? You'll understand it. But the test is not so much whether it's biased or unbiased. The test is whether the evidence that you're quoting is reliable. You can't say that somebody said to me that Mahmud of Ghazni raided 77 times. You know, what is the evidence for your saying so? You must have evidence, and the evidence must be reliable, which means in our terms, in historical terms, if it is written evidence, it's much easier to handle than an oral tradition, even though an oral tradition may be equally reliable, but a written evidence is always much easier to handle. Okay, so your reliable evidence is the first step. Secondly, history is a study in causal relationships. Because A happened, it led to B, and because B happened, it led to C. There's a whole chain of events that connects, and we are working back on that chain and getting back to the beginning. Now, those causal relationships, when they are being established by the historian, must be based on logic and rationality. They cannot be mystical, they cannot be mythological. They have to be logical and rational, which is why there's a world of difference between history and mythology, history and faith. I'm not saying that mythology has no value, it has a lot of value, but you cannot take mythology as history without putting it through this test. And the test is very important. And this, in a sense, is also something that distinguishes the big change that happened to the discipline of history in the 1960s or 70s.
Which was?
Which is that prior to that, history was regarded as Indology. And Indology simply means the study of something Indian. It can be the study of seashells from the coastline of Gujarat, or it can be, you know, brick temples from Bengal, or whatever. Anything Indian, the study of that becomes part of Indology. When history becomes a social science, it then begins to observe certain rules of evidence collection, analysis, and how these analyses are put together in the context of other social sciences, in the sense that there is a working together of sociology, economics, anthropology, history, demography, you name it. So that the causes, the range of causes gets widened. For example, today, when they're discussing the decline of the Harappan cities, there was a time when everybody said it was an Aryan invasion. That went out. Then everybody said it was a massacre of some kind, and they ran short of food, there was disease and so on.
Major disaster.
Major disaster. Now the argument is environmental change.
Yeah.
You know, deforestation, change of river courses, climate change. So as you begin to introduce more and more ways of looking at the problem, the range of causes gets broader, and history becomes much more realistic then. I mean, this is not to say that you take the romance out of history, but that comes at another level. The basic history becomes more realistic.
Since you mentioned the Harappan civilization, before I go to my next question, I just wanted to, this attempt again to constantly link the Harappan script, which has posed, you know, huge challenges to historical understanding. And we've reached thus far, but no further, with the Indo-Aryan script, and then therefore to provide that, again, that link which becomes one of a community superiority, etc. And that claim on the ancient Indian past. How is that worked out?
Well, that's really, in some senses, logical. Because in the 19th century, the earliest, the foundation of Indian civilization were the Vedic texts. They were the earliest bit of evidence we had. And so the whole construction of the Hindu Arya was based on the Vedic texts. Nobody, of course, mentioned that at that time in the 5th, 4th centuries BC, there were a lot of people who were opposed to the Vedic texts, like the Buddha and Mahavir, the Ajivakas, the Charvaks, and so on. Very solid body of people known as the Nastikas by the Vedic Brahmins.
The public intellectual that you said questioned.
That's right, yes, the public intellectuals. So the beginnings of the Hindu civilization were the Hindu Arya, the Vedic Aryan. Now then in the 20s, they discovered this civilization which is earlier than the Vedic. So what do you do with this? You try and prove that it was Aryan by saying that the script should be read as Vedic Indo-Aryan. That doesn't seem to work. There are others who are reading it as Dravidian. Attempts are being made. There's one attempt now being made this very moment practically in Chennai by Mahadevan, who's reading it as Dravidian pictograms with an Indo-Aryan cross-check kind of thing. Very interesting pieces. But nothing is proven. We don't know. So if you're going to say that the roots of India lie in the Aryan civilization, you have to take it back to the Harappan. It's logical. Because otherwise, you have to argue, as some of them do, that the Vedic texts are pre-Harappan, which takes them back to 5000 BC, 4000 BC to bring them up to 3000, for which the evidence is really not available. But otherwise, then you have to say that they were all Aryans together. So now let's see where that takes us.